As the Great War moved past the winter of 1914-15, and the armies began once again to strive for breakthrough and victory, the world would see the first major use of a new form of weaponry that unto itself wasn't machine or firearm. This, of course, was the awful and hugely significant use of what was simply termed gas. The first use of gas was in April of 1915, as the Germans attempted to break the Allied lines outside of Ypres, with the help of clouds of chlorine released from cylinders dug into their frontline trenches. The wind carried the yellow clouds south, over the trenches manned by French territorial troops, who were unprotected and could not resist this horrible new weapon. The immense and near-run Battle of Second Ypres changed warfare forever. The British Army used gas for the very first time later that year at the Battle of Loos. While having a modicum of success, it did not guarantee victory, and the battle became one of the many of 1915 that seemed to have good prospects, but ultimately could not deliver anything close to ultimate victory. From then, the use of gas became increasingly paradoxical. It became more dangerous and lethal in composition, but overall became less lethal due to ever-improving personal protective equipment. It became ever more omnipresent and was used as a way to reduce the effectiveness of the enemy rather than as a direct and lethal weapon, by forcing them to don their protective yet confining, uncomfortable equipment that made breathing difficult and sustained work on the battlefield an enormous effort. Eventually, these protective measures moved beyond the urine-soaked handkerchiefs used at Second Ypres. They were first issued as literally a chemical-soaked pad strapped across the mouth and a pair of goggles. By later in 1915, a dedicated piece of kit would be introduced, the gas hood. This chemical-soaked fabric bag with various forms of incrementally improving vision and breathing arrangements was what the Army used as protection from gas vapors until 1917, when the small box respirator was introduced. This item should be seen as the first modern respirator in British and Empire service, and it featured a dedicated facepiece and filter canister. It would be this form of protection that would add to the iconic image of the British and Empire soldier in the last years of the Great War, and in improved form for the first half of the Second World War, at which point it was eventually replaced with a lighter and more economical design. In this video, we'll examine 3 different types of anti-gas protection found in use during the Great War and evaluate their effects primarily on the use of the rifle. Gas or chemical warfare remains one of the truly horrifying realities of conflict. While it was a very significant part of the Great War, the men who fought it somehow managed to persevere, either locally or, in a larger sense, making do and surviving to fight in its awful environment. I can only hope that this project may give some insight into the difficulties and conditions that men forced to protect themselves against it had to endure and overcome. This short 2-part video series isn't an examination of gas warfare per se, but rather a study of the effects on soldiers' performance, and those of the British Empire in particular, as influenced by the kit and equipment they were forced to use. The rifle used for this video is the Channel's SMLE. It was this rifle that the British Empire used throughout the Great War, notwithstanding, of course, the use of the Ross by Canadian troops until 1916. This is in fact a Mark III Star, which is exemplified by the various omissions of parts and features during manufacture, which began in 1916. The equipment used is, of course, the 1908 pattern Webb equipment. By far the most advanced set of infantry equipment used during the Great War, and would serve on until the eve of the Second World War. The equipment most salient for this project are the various forms of British Empire anti-gas equipment used during the Great War. These changed significantly between 1915 and 1918. Each pattern was an incremental improvement over that which came before, but it would take until 1917 for a truly modern respirator to enter British and Empire service. The gas attacks of late April 1915 caused a flurry of activity as the Army tried desperately to find a solution to this horrible new weapon. From mid-1915, the first official pattern of anti-gas equipment was simply a thick gauze pad soaked in a hyposulfate solution. This was known as the black veil respirator, from the black cheesecloth-like material that was used to hold the chemical-soaked pad to the face. The veil could also be used to cover the eyes. Around this time, simple goggles also began to be issued. These somewhat expedient measures were in the hands of the troops only weeks after the 22nd of April. In June of 1915, a purpose-designed respirator was introduced, the smoke helmet, also known as the hypo helmet. This was in the form of a bag-like flannelette hood soaked in glycerin and sodium thiosulfate. It featured a single mica eyepiece. Interestingly, it was to be used in its soaked state, and it was carried in a waterproof lined satchel to hold in the moisture. By late 1915, this was superseded by the tube helmet, which evolved into three variations: the P, PH, and PHG helmets. Although similar in overall concept to the hypo helmet, this pattern featured a double-layer flannelette and two glass eyepieces. With the looming threat of the use of phosgene, hexamethylene tetramine was added to the solution to combat this new and very dangerous gas. In order to combat excessive fogging of the lenses, an exhalation assembly was added to allow for the breath to be expelled from inside the hood, rather than the user breathing straight back into its confines. This featured a simple metal tube let into the front face of the fabric that the wearer held in their mouth. To the outside was fixed a rubber clapper valve style arrangement that only allowed exhalation. The P and PH hoods didn't protect the user from so-called tear gases, so a modification was made to incorporate a set of goggles into the PH hood. This resulted in the PHG helmet, the G standing for goggles. In 1917, the first modern respirator was developed and issued. This became known as the small box respirator, and was a departure from the hood style used previously. It had a separate rubberized facepiece with two eyepieces, an exhalation valve, and a breathing tube with a mouthpiece and a nose clamp. It was held to the face by a series of elasticated straps. The salient feature was a filter canister, held in the haversack, which contained the ingredients to filter out and absorb the gas. This respirator would feature from 1917 on until the end of the war. Once respirators were issued, they became ubiquitous on the Western Front. Their use was heavily regulated with instructions and directions. When not in use, they were carried in the appropriate styled haversack. For the hypo and PH variety, it was worn on the left shoulder, and if two were carried, which became prevalent throughout the mid-part of the war, then they were slung one over each shoulder. A peculiarity of Highland soldiers was a practice of carrying the haversack in the manner of a sporran across the front of the kilt. Now, this was done only when out of the line, and certainly not universally. In the line, it was carried in the same manner as the rest of the troops, with the apron's pocket providing for small items to be carried. The SBR was carried at the position known as the alert when in the line, that is to say, on the chest, under the chin, with the flap opening outward. This allowed for 1, quick access, and 2, it was needed to be near the face, as the haversack carried the canister. When out of the line, the SBR could be slung at the left hip by regulation, but photographic evidence would show that this practice wasn't always followed. Alternately, the SBR could be laid atop the haversack or the large pack behind the head, and the strap left to dangle or be tucked in at the front of the belt behind the buckle. Regardless of the way it was carried, the respirator remained a part of the man's personal kit, and it was kept on the person at all times, as even in rear areas, gas shells could be used to deliver the deadly chemicals. For this video and the experiments therein, I chose 3 reproductions readily available from vendors such as What Price Glory or Soldier of Fortune to stand in for the originals. I decided not to replicate the Black Veil respirator and instead focused on the 3 that I thought might offer the most variation as far as shooting and sightlines went: the smoke hood, the PH hood, and the small box respirator. The former 2 would be soaked in water to replicate the wet nature of the hood-style respirator when in service use. The targets used were the second-class figure target that was used for all musketry programs and courses during the war, and select examples of the series of standalone figure targets of the same era. For ammunition, I used my usual cast loads that I use in the majority of my .303 rifles. A 210 grain cast bullet atop 24 grains of IMR 4227. These, of course, were placed into chargers and carried in the webbing. I decided that I'd assess each respirator against 3 criteria, or rather through 3 activities: grouping, rapid shooting, and by means of a action shoot or dynamic shooting scheme involving moving, shooting, and other battlefield undertakings associated with attacking an enemy position, all for a total of 25 rounds. I thought that these 3 activities might assemble into a reasonable model to enable comment to be passed on just how these gas hoods and respirators were in use. The groupings would be first. Donning of the smoke or hypo helmet was straightforward, if somewhat fiddly. First, the headdress was removed and secured. Then the haversack was unbuttoned, and then the inner waterproof liner was opened. The helmet was folded neatly inside to protect the somewhat fragile mica eyepiece. This, being a reproduction, features a more flexible plastic eyepiece. Note the darker color of the material, soaked in water. The hood was pulled on over the head, and the eyepiece oriented to the front. The collar was unbuttoned, and the skirt of the helmet tucked inside. This process was somewhat laborious. I suppose that the collar could have been unbuttoned previously, but in retrospect, this would not have made things much more efficient. Once the hood was tucked in, the collar was done up enough to afford some degree of closure around the bottom of the hood. The intent, after all, was to breathe through the fabric rather than from underneath its bottom edge. Headdress was expressly forbidden to be worn in order to preserve the integrity of the stitching and the chemical soaking of the hood. From the customary prone position, loading was straightforward, although the ability to look down at the pouches was certainly curtailed to a degree due to the nature of the single eyepiece. Already, the eyepiece was showing the first signs of fogging. Before I settled down to shoot, I had to push the eyepiece onto my forehead to wipe the condensation away. As is evidenced here, breathing deeply caused the wet fabric to suck in around my head. The claustrophobic nature of the hood was coming home to roost. As the grouping progressed, the fogging continued, and near constant adjustment of the hood was required.
There's 5 rounds with the 1915 era hypo gas hood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Group's a little bit high and rather larger than would be typical. However, I did notice that through looking through the lens, which in this case of course is plastic because it's a reproduction, it made the entire sight picture very fuzzy. Just the way that the plastic sort of bent in front of the eye. And both the back sight, the front sight, and the target were quite muddled. It was very hard to ascertain the bottom edge of the figure, and quite frankly I was using the color break between the green and the gray here more than I was the figure and the bottom edge of it to try and orient my sight picture. So was I aiming somewhere probably in the center here? Chances are, and that would explain why the group is a little bit high. Let's see how big the group is. Let's call it 9.5, 9.25, somewhere around there.
Next up was grouping with the PH helmet. Donning it was virtually the same as with the smoke helmet. With the mouthpiece, the eyepieces did seem to align to the eyes a bit more reasonably. Sticking to period practice, the steel helmet was left off. As I settled into the firing position, a similar experience was noted as it pertained to visibility. Looking down, or in this case back to the pouch, was essentially impossible. In addition, the helmet had to be pulled off to the left in order for the right eyepiece to afford an unobstructed view through to the sights. As the grouping progressed, the glass eyepieces did seem to create less distortion than the flexible version of the hypo helmet. And although there was some fogging, the 5 rounds were shot quite smoothly. The exhalation valve certainly would seem to have been doing its job.
Well, there's 5 rounds with the PH hood. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Measuring 4.5 inches. So not top marks, which would be a 4-inch group, but fairly close. And considering I am looking through the eyepieces of a gas hood, I'm happy with that.
The last grouping would of course be with the small box respirator. With the haversack in the alert position on the chest, the helmet would be removed and the face piece withdrawn. Pulled over the face, the nose clip and mouthpiece were oriented and the straps fine-tuned. Without the same considerations regarding wear and tear as with the hood-type items, the steel helmet was placed back on top of the head. Going into the grouping, a slight adjustment of the eyepiece was needed. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there was some fogging, and this was cleared by pressing the lens onto my forehead. According to period documentation, the cut of the rubberized fabric of the facepiece was such that portions of it at the side of the eyepieces could be pushed in with the finger, allowing for wiping of the eyepiece.
Ugh.
To be honest, my expectations weren't high of this group. There was a certain gust of wind that interrupted things halfway along.
So 5 rounds with the small box respirator. 1, 2, 3, and a double, 4, 5. Measuring 5 inches. All right. It's seems to be I'm not going to be able to get a 4-inch group today. Anyway, by way of comment on how this particular respirator affected things, I would say that it was better than the other two, in the sense that the eyepieces were located in front of my eyes in a reasonable fashion. The fogging was more ambient sort of conditions around my face than it was breathing on it. When we look at the hypo hood and the fact that you're just breathing in and out inside a bag, at least the PH had an exhalation valve in which you wouldn't be breathing your hot air back inside At least it was going outside the hood. And in this case, your breathing is completely confined to through the hose and the canister. There were a few instances where it did get a little bit foggy. I had to push the lens up against my eyebrow to sort of try and remove some of the condensation. That said, it certainly wasn't completely fogged in.
So the groupings were a bit varied, and not as consistent as I would otherwise expect. Par for the course, I suppose, given the ocular interference of the various lenses. For the rapid practices, I decided to introduce a small dash, or stumble as the case may be, before adopting the fire position, loading, and firing. Perhaps I was thinking that even this moderate activity would serve as a bit of a springboard towards the more dynamic practice number 3. In addition, the range was increased to 150 yards, and, as per musketry training of the era, the rifle was to be loaded and fired with no more than 5 rounds at a time. In retrospect, I probably should have started with a loaded rifle, but at the time, I was thinking that the more activity there was, the better the assessment of the particular respirator would be. First up was the hypo helmet. The dash was pretty straightforward, but the reduced visibility of the hypo helmet really precluded any kind of speed, as without being able to see the ground very well, I was afraid of stumbling and falling, as epic a fail as that would have been. As I glanced up at the target, I was to get my first taste of huffing and puffing into a plastic lens in front of my face. Things started okay with a dead center hit, but with the distortion of the plastic lens and the fogging, success was evidently fleeting.
Come on.
It was kind of like looking through a foggy Coke bottle. The moisture on the inside of the lens distorted everything, and finding the target amongst the grass and the logs was very difficult. Evidently, the quality control of my ammunition was just a little bit substandard here. That was a reversed primer. So, the first rapid practice was a bit disappointing. 2 hits in 2 minutes 16 seconds. Included in that time was an awful lot of fiddling with the hood. Next up was the PH helmet. Right off the bat, I could anticipate more success. The lenses of this style of respirator are, and understandably were, superior either to the historical mica or the plastic of the reproduction of the hypo helmet. During the dash, visibility was better, but still required deliberate lowering of the head to avoid obstacles. Loading was straightforward, although done partly by feel, as actually seeing the pouch was out of the question. Even when slightly fogged, these lenses at least gave some modicum of view over the sights to the target. Five rounds down, and so far, so good.
a much better effort. 9 hits in 1 minute, 21 seconds. The last rapid was to be shot with the SBR. At the start, visibility was by far the best with the SBR. The nose clip and mouthpiece are instrumental in keeping the eyepieces aligned with the face. Downward sight lines are not perfect, however. As you can see, loading was as much by feel as with the others. Starting off, I felt that things would be pretty good. Decent eyepieces would seemingly provide for a similar experience to the PH hood. For some reason, however, probably due to some fogging issues, I evidently began to shoot high, and all of a sudden, my expectations needed to be managed heavily. You can imagine what was going through my head when the first 3 rounds missed. For crying out loud. The eagle eye amongst you will have noticed that in adjusting my eyepiece, I actually hit the bolt handle. Of course, the rifle functioned properly and did not fire. Not seeing this due to the restricted view, rather than just closing the bolt fully, I cycled the action to clear the stoppage. Proper drills, yes, but it cost me a round. A disappointing 4 hits in 1 minute, 41 seconds. So that brings us to the end of part 1 of this series. In part 2, we'll feature practice number 3, the assault course, and provide for some analysis and commentary on my performance wearing these 3 respirators. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well.